Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Well, here's another conversation with my son, Dave, about practice. Yes, of course, because that's the big question. What is practice? What do we know about it? Why don't we know more? I certainly have made an effort so far to pursue that question with over 200 conversations, because one thing that Peter says in one of our conjectures is that each person who is a practitioner is the one who knows what that means to them and knows how it helps them be who they are. And the best way to discover that is to have a conversation and listen carefully. What Dave and I have been doing, though, is trying to probe more deeply into what practice is when it's happening. And in this conversation, it gives us a chance to look at the act, A-C-T, itself, because practice is behavior and it is doing. And in those moments when the act is occurring, a lot of things are happening behind our eyebrows. Dave has an abiding fascination with all things having to do with the mind, the brain, consciousness, and social conversation that leads to mutual understanding and mutual action. So here is another conversation with Dave and Dad. Almost all of the podcasts that I've recorded have been done virtually through Zoom. But in two instances now, Dave and I have actually been together face-to-face, once in Maine and now here in Baltimore. And in both instances, we're trying out the same conversation with a recorder as opposed to the Zoom mechanism. So this conversation may or may not work technically, but at the basis of an awful lot of what Dave has shared particularly is something I discovered in recent podcast conversations with scholars who are now of an age when they were breaking into the organization studies fields, they studied what I would consider some of the original thinkers. For example, Dave, someone you've mentioned several times, George Herbert Meade. And if you would refresh my memory about Meade's approach to human interaction, which we eventually call social inaction, then you can help the old man understand things better.
Well, George Herbert Meade was considered one of the school of philosophy called American pragmatism, called American mostly because it was one of the philosophical areas, probably one of the few actually born in the United States through a number of practitioners, some of whom I think, I believe William James was considered, his field was psychology.
Yes.
But was certainly someone who was looked at among the philosophers as roughly in the school of thought of pragmatism, but others were John Dewey and then Peirce.
Yeah, we cannot forget Peirce.
George Herbert Meade did his schooling around the time where William James was already established professor, and I think Peirce was already well through his career. I think he'd already been thrown out of Johns Hopkins at that time.
And we're at Johns Hopkins, or very nearby right now.
Yeah, and so I would say most of Meade's writings by the time he was out of grad school and becoming a philosopher was in late 1800s. And some of his, he didn't do a lot of writing, and I would say most of his influential papers were in the early 20th century. And then a lot of his, what he's known for was mostly through his lectures that were written down by his students. So I don't know that he had quite the systematic body of work that someone like John Dewey did, the way he developed his blending of philosophy of mind into the pragmatism and the psychology of the day and observations of behavior, I think became influential, especially to John Dewey, but also to area of social, what's called social psychology, mostly because it influenced sociologists more than it did psychology, which went into more of the behaviorism at the time, and experimental psychology later on, and then cognitive psychology, which continued into a somewhat different line and didn't ever really blend back into social psychology very well to this day. But from that tradition, especially fields called symbolic interactionism and certain areas of focus on language and linguistics, Meade's had some influence.
I wonder, before you move on that, how, maybe it's no way of knowing this, but you mentioned the students did a lot of careful listening and gave us much of Meade's thought. But I wonder if any of those gentlemen interacted directly with each other, or at least by correspondence.
I really don't know.
Yeah, I mean, because we talk about Dewey and James and Meade in person, sort of like a club, but they're not. I mean, but their work came out around the late 1800s and some into the early 1900s. I wonder if at least they read each other's stuff.
I think there was a community. I think they mostly were all in the East for the most part during those formative years, and so I imagine there was some community. But a lot of it was through students who kind of championed and kept the ideas going. And again, many of those were in a fairly narrow field of social psychology, called symbolic interactionism. But when I picked him up, I was kind of, I'd mentioned before, I'd studied with Tom Morioni at Colby College, who was himself studied with Herbert Bloomer in his later years at Berkeley in California, and Herbert Bloomer studied with Meade.
I'd forgotten that connection.
Yeah, so he was there was that chain at least of students that I guess I'd be fourth generation of hearing about the ideas, and then picked them up, and then I towards the end of college I started blending Meade's ideas with what I was learning in neuropsychology and physiology from Dr. Eddie Tarian, who was at Colby, who himself had done quite a lot of work in the structure of what used to be called the limbic system. Now it's not considered a system per se, but many systems, but the area that's heavily tied to emotions, and its interaction and its heavy integration with the cortex, which at the time really was a new physical clue that wasn't there before, that the emotion parts of the brain and the neocortex, which is supposed to be the most advanced for humans, is actually tied together very closely throughout the most complex things that human brains can do. The emotions, the ties to the emotion systems are right there.
Yeah.
And in some of our earlier talks, we are now getting to the point of answering even more reasons why that may be important to the very nature of consciousness.
Yeah. I will interject again that there is a pattern that you mentioned of people studying with the original thinkers as students and then carrying that on, and we can assume that people then learn from them who later on then learn from their successors if they were all somewhat in the academic world, philosophy, social psychology, sociological sociology. And I'm jumping way ahead for just a moment to say that when I've talked to some of the folks for the podcast who are well into their career, even retired as writers and professors, they almost automatically, when I ask them, well, tell me a little bit about yourself, they'll go right back to, well, I studied with Churchman at Berkeley, or I studied with, Peter Vale would say, I studied with Eric Trist from at Harvard, and Rothsberger. And so I guess what I'm saying is, here I am in this work that I've taken on in my retirement years, carrying on Peter Vale and the thinking that he's been able to at least consolidate in the book that he got started and I finished, called On Practice as a Way of Being. And so, we're kind of like benefactors of people who go way back. Peter also was very close to the system world and probably read Meade originally, Meade's original papers.
But Meade wouldn't, at that time, there wasn't really the concept of systems thinking.
No.
There wasn't a concept of the computational method of the brain so much.
Right.
He would be, behaviorism was a thing then. I mean, he kind of critiqued it even in its early form. But where he would have come from is an appreciation of the biological, and I think that I don't know this for sure, but I think you could really find those themes in the pragmatism of the time. The idea that human beings are still animals; they live in a biological world, and that's really where systems thinking about the brain, and really, I think about pretty much everything humans do, is right there. You have to understand the biological. It's not putting models of computers onto society. It's not putting machines onto society.
Right.
There was already that trend starting at the turn of the 20th century for sure.
Yeah.
But it's always been, I think, a misdirection. And I think the systems thinking of the sort that I've been talking about in some of our talks, inaction, embodied cognition, the self-organizing systems theory, all of that I've been able to find to be compatible with Meade, because I think Meade wasn't in that. He was in that I guess area of metaphor.
Yeah.
He certainly would have known Darwin, natural selection, and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
And early neurophysiology. He did study some of that in Europe.
Now, remind me of a couple of the points that you've taken from Meade, and I remember one of them was the act.
Yes.
That's sort of a pivotal point for understanding what he was offering us.
I think so. And I've been considering the idea, looking at some of these newer ideas of what's the nature of human consciousness. Human consciousness in a very, some might say, a deflationary sense, and then not so much the mystical consciousness, but how do we have a mind? How do we have a subjectivity? How do we know what it's like to be us, or to experience the color red?
Right.
The problem of mind and body. And having that be something that is, organically grown out of the activity of the brain within a world in which we interact, and our world being so heavily social that it is literally how we subjectively feel existence.
So, what is the act?
So the act, he broke it down in an interesting way. Remember, at the time of behaviorism, the notion of the act was pretty much stimulus and response.
Right,
There's external,
Skinnerian.
which is very mechanistic. So there's external stimuli. There's sets of a black box in the brain connecting A to B, and then you get output, which is a bunch of templates. Even as one added some early notions of current cognitive science, usually what would be done is simply putting a representation in between one's input and output, and then various ways of representing it would connect the associated parts of the brain, and then you get output. But it's very much that external to internal to external behavior was still seen, I think, kind of as a straight line. And one of the systems things in Meade that you could see if you look carefully at his work was the idea that it wasn't simply one way; it was an interaction, all the way down, all the way. It's really individual interacting with the world, and in a particular sequence. And the sequence of an act, he says, started with an impulse. The impulse first, and the impulse didn't necessarily. It wasn't quite a stimulus. It wasn't from the outside. It was an interaction of inside and outside. And then from there, it went to perception, which wasn't just, the impressions of the outside fitting into the little squares on the inside that would turn it into a representation. It was very much, again, an interaction in which you were predicting, to a degree, what was going to happen and seeing how well it fit at that moment. So which in the prediction he called meaning. And meaning was defined as a tendency to act. And this idea of tendency to act as coming from the impulse. So the impulse kind of gets you seeing, well, what is it in the world that's been a perturbation to what was going on before? The meaning is a tendency to act. So perception was very much not just sensory, but sensory motor, sensory action, sensory immediately towards predicting what one might do in addition to what one might perceive. So,
Tested in the moment, you mean, right away to some kind of action?
It's already kind of prepping something for testing. But it's one where part of that test is what you're going to do about it away.
Yeah.
And then what's when you're actually doing something about it, he called that the manipulation phase, where you're interacting with the world, and then the consummation phase, which is very much kind of a measuring, an evaluation of how well it went.
Yeah.
And there's a measure of goodness and badness, or well-fitting, ill-fitting, and the degree to which, if something's ill-fitting to the prediction, and if your adjustment hasn't gone well, the adjustment might create more impulse or a new impulse, or start making a new course of action in which you are either moving yourself towards some solution to the error in prediction, or adjusting your perception of the situation itself. And
yeah.
And that's a very current notion. It's called it's predictive processing. What I've been talking about, the inaction or embodied cognition.
Right.
That in itself is a systems model. Systems or self-organization based model. It's one where currently you'll see it talked about by the Carl Friston, neurophysiologist or neuroscience and neuropsychologist, who talks about free energy, which is an information processing model of sorts, where the error between prediction and what one perceives is an actual is expressed physiologically as sort of a degree of entropy, which can take a self-organization self-organizing system beyond what's sustainable, and then break it apart and create a sudden reorganization amongst potential options based on the what potentially can be done among a system of constraints. But what that is a complicated way of expressing what has grown or even evolved in a sense as one's capacity to act based on memories, based on what's been learned,
Yeah.
based on what's perceivable in the immediate situation.
Yeah.
And this went back to our talk on Ilya and the nature of living systems.
I remember well. I love that name.
Yeah, and the dissipation of entropy by any living system. And so I've begun to argue that perhaps when we're talking about the act, we're not necessarily talking about just neurons, but we're talking about neuronal groups and patterns of firing and the persistence of patterns of firing.
Yeah.
And what they can do. And then there's a whole other complicated one we got into in another podcast where how to express the dynamics of it. And we talked about the Markov blanket.
I remember that.
Maybe we'll bring that up again later. But
Yeah.
only so many tangents we can get into. But what the point is for the act is I'm arguing that it is very much a systems, a very current approach to embodied cognition, social inaction, both social and physiological inaction, in the way we've been talking about it. And it's one where there's it's just a different way of approaching a lot of these questions, but one that is very much in tune with so much of other biological living systems that you don't get into certain contradictions that you do with other approaches.
Right. Starting way back with Meade's interest in the biology of human and the sameness among animals. Mm-hmm. I would love over this tiny fence that we're sitting next to between us, the current buzz or conversation, particularly at the Management and Organization Behavior Conference I just attended earlier this week, which is AI, artificial intelligence, and how that works with or for or against the human aspect of all life, particularly organization life. And as I'm listening to your review, the thinking from Meade on, I think my sense of it is that there's no way, I think, in hell that people who write code are ever going to be able to come even close to what you just described that we all do moment to moment, and with the brain fixing in emotions and with the predictive aspects of our minds. I'm trying to champion the human intelligence, but maybe I'm taking it to a much more pedantic level, Dave, than you're seeing it.
Not necessarily. There's a couple of. I mean, we don't have to go too deep into that, but I think most of what you'll hear currently on things like the chatbots, those are, or even voice recognition from your phone. That is thoroughly computational. It's not at all based on living systems dynamics at all. It is able to do a very good job. 20 years ago, it was thought to be almost impossible even to do what's being done now. But what's being done now is by brute force computation. Yeah. And it's fine, but it's just running algorithms in a way that's not at all like the brain does. It beyond to a certain degree, having consistent associations, patterns that do exist between phrases and things like that, but only in an abstracted sense. Yeah. Now there are some people, even Mark Solms, who I talked to before, is working with a group who's trying to turn some of these embodied cognition ideas into better AI. But I think what they'll find is what they find even with this, like the quantum computing, that they don't have that the ways of constraining the possibilities can't be built in well into the code.
Yeah.
Because by nature they become heavily stochastic, heavily reliant on having lived a life, basically, before.
Well,
and
there's our edge as humans.
Being a human.
There's our edge.
In a real
we're
world.
living a life
in
a real world, and we are experiencing it act by act, and we're maybe almost unconsciously, if not unconsciously, working on the things you've just described, day and night, probably while we're asleep.
Yeah.
And see, I'm a champion of practice, and I think that it's miraculous how any particular person who's committed themselves to a course of action, indefinitely, courses of action, therefore to become more skillful, more knowledgeable, all the others. To me, that's where we get our hope.
Yeah, but that said, there is something to AI that I think we could think about, and the analogy would be to something like reading and writing. Because the brain, I think one could argue the brain evolved to conversation. That's the basis.
Yes.
Over 250,000 years or whatever it was, the brain evolved from other two-legged primates to around conversation, and maybe we can get into another aspect of Meade because Meade talked very well and clearly about how that might have happened.
Mm-hmm.
But my quick point about AI is that, like reading and writing, that's an adaptation. That's maybe only a few thousand years old, and only in the last 100 years has the majority of humans been able to even do it.
Well, that's
if
true.
If it is now the majority, I don't know. Probably we might have gone past the majority, but still, you can live your life not knowing how to read or write.
Yeah.
You can still converse now. So that's an adaptation. The brain did not evolve to that. Otherwise, it'd probably be, as easy to learn to read and write as it is to learn to speak.
It clearly isn't.
Yeah. So it does take a little time and skill, and the older you are, the harder it is. But my point for AI is that part of so there's the capacity to adapt, and the other aspect of AI is a philosopher of mine named Andy Clark, who's in Edinburgh, I think. He has some terrific articles on from this embodied kind of an active approach to cognition and mind. He talks about the extended mind extending into things like using your iPhone, where the act is completed by actions on the phone. In a more direct sense than not. One perhaps where you could even argue that part of the system, or this kind of Markov blanket thing of external surfaces and internal relationships that are self-organizing and persistent over time, rely on this external thing. What happens on the phone, or what happens when you interact with a search engine or Google to complete the act.
Yeah.
And you can extend to that. Well, what if that, the computer side being very mechanical, and yet it's still systematically presenting something in an interactive way that could become sort of an extension and perhaps an enhancement of interaction.
Yeah.
Even if the AI itself isn't just like a brain, it becomes an extension of human brains.
See, I wouldn't mind that. I mean, I'd say, okay,
I'm
that's
sure it
good.
could go wrong
That's
somehow.
like going back to the original tools. I mean, if we look at the instruments of artificial intelligence as tools that extend our capacities in many particular ways, that would be something to look forward to.
Yeah, the downside of that, I don't think I can multiply anymore in my head. So, because I've used a calculator too long.
I remember you had to learn the timetables when you were in elementary school.
Yeah, and kids don't know cursive anymore, and so things do. The brain is
we
very
do
efficient.
Give up, don't we?
They do atrophy, and so there's a downside to that.
What part do you think that it goes to that other conversation we've had about retrieving memories and stuff? But when you're trying to do something. And it's just like if you don't do it, it fades into a point of a memory where it's relegated to never mind.
Yeah. I mean, it does take energy to things to persist, and there is that sense of neuronal groups that are actual connections of neurons. But
I remember that.
They do have to be fed. They have to keep active. They get very thick for very basic things, but they don't for other things. And in some ways, they can get kind of reused. Like I just last week I was speaking to a neuroscientist, Dr. Marina Bedney, who's done some very interesting research on people born blind, and looking at their visual cortex with fMRIs, looking at the activity of the brain.
Wow!
And seeing some evidence that. They're using their parts of their visual cortex in ways that sighted people don't, to do things that are kind of language and cognition like, substituting various aspects that we might use our eyes and sight of objects for something else, but it's still those similar parts of the brain that
so something they may hear.
Yeah, and where the earlier idea is that those parts of the brain simply atrophy, but they don't. They're used, but they're used differently.
Yeah.
So
use it or lose it. Yeah. Well, I'm watching our time limit, but I'm delighted that we started this off. It's a bit of a review, but it becomes very much of the moment when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about the championing of the human capacity to continually learn and grow, largely through repetitive work or repetitive action, which we then call practice. So, am I able to conclude, Dave, that if someone adopts something that they want to do continuously, and even though the circumstances change, act by act, they will become, let's say, what would the word be?
Well, practice leads to practice. I think we're arguing there, like practice as in doing something over and over.
Yeah, but it's fundamentally what it is. But in the doing over and over, in other words, whatever you want to take, I want to be a master plumber. Of course, I'm going to continually learn the basics, and then I'm going to be seeing where things are not as I expected them to be, perception. And so then you try a fix to see if you can make it work in the moment. And so you're always in that moment where you move into the next second or two where something comes up and it's different than what you're ready for. And that puts us back into, what I'm hearing you say that Meade and the other pragmatists say is how we become more fully, whatever do we say, more fully human or more fully skillful or more fully knowledge enabled. Of course, I'm taking it way off the direct line that you're talking about, but what's your thought on that?
Well, I mean, I think the one of the issues is, yes, we're abstracting something about, for example, learning.
Yeah.
But that we have to understand learning in these closer quarters of what is the systematic interaction with the world moment to moment, and how does that matter for the persistence of any growth of something new that's learned.
Yeah.
And that new and what's learned becomes increasingly it becomes increasingly unconscious. That's one of the things we're saying.
Yeah.
And I've been arguing that the The act is a moment of consciousness. It's one in which the impulse is connected to an emotion.
Yeah.
The emotions, and right down to the brainstem, and it's a moment of an observer and subjective observer coming into being about that and experiencing what it is to know that one's predictive actions that should have been automatic are now just a little off and become meaningful, literally meaningful in the way that this sensory motor construction has now become something that we have to think about, talk about,
talk to others about,
and having that capacity to be social, which maybe in the next podcast I'll really lay out how that works.
I really would like to talk more about that, because that puts us straight into the center of what Peter and I put in to the book and engendered in the podcast, which is to help people understand how each individual person in practice is creating essentially their way of being. They're creating themselves. And I think probably the quick leap to what you said is, as you're creating yourself, what you're doing is because you are putting yourself into situations where meaning must be made. In other words, you're taking yourself to where you haven't been before, or you suddenly notice that something's different. So you've got to do something differently. Therefore, you have to kind of know something differently, and your autonomic system reaches around in your memory, and however you've assembled those neurons, and says, "Do we know what the hell this is?"
Right.
And your mind says no.
Yeah.
And so if you do have someone next to you, like I have you next to me, you say, well, help me understand it.
Right.
So,
and that's a conversational process.
There you go. Well, Dave, thank you again. I'm looking forward to seeing how this comes out, since I have my new birthday microphone, which you've given me, and also had this rare opportunity to be here in Baltimore, in your nice home, visiting, being the old man.
So next time I'll get my notes together and do a lecture on how George Herbert Meade's model of languaging by human beings is consistent with a lot of current thinking from this particular point of view, this embodied cognition, this enactionist approach to both cognition and human interaction. But I haven't found anyone who's taken all that deeply into details of how language works.
Yep.
We may not get that far, but I want to lay out more of the pieces.
Well, I think it's important for the world to know, so keep at it, Dave. Thank you again. Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to enactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to enactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
Oh, and one more thing. How could I forget? The book on practice as a way of being is available now in digital form, something that would be new, like podcasting to many of us. And it's a great way of learning more and more about what this podcast presented when Peter Vale and I originated it several years ago. So please come to mylibrary.world/practice, and you'll see what I mean. Thank you.